I never thought a snow rake would change my life, but here we are. It was the third week of January, and Maplewood Estates had been hit with back-to-back snowstorms that left nearly 2 feet of heavy, wet snow sitting on every rooftop in the neighborhood. The kind of snow that slides off in chunks and crushes your gutters, caves in your garden shed roof, or worse, builds up into ice dams that send water trickling down through your attic insulation and into your living room ceiling. I'd seen it happen to my buddy Dave 2 winters ago. He ended up with a water stain on his ceiling the size of a pizza and a contractor bill that made him cry a little. I wasn't going to let that happen to my house. So on a Saturday morning early around 7:30, I bundled up in my heavy Carhartt jacket, my thermal gloves, and my boots that could handle -20, and I grabbed my roof snow rake from the garage. It's a solid aluminum telescoping tool with a long handle and a flat plastic blade that you drag across the roof surface to pull the snow down. When it drags across the shingles, yes, it makes a scraping noise. That's kind of the whole point. You're dragging metal and plastic across a roof. Physics doesn't take a vacation just because Janet Crane lives across the street. I had barely finished one pass across the lower section of my roof when I heard a window slam open from across the cul-de-sac. I didn't even look up. I knew that sound. That was Janet Crane's storm window, the one she throws open whenever she spots something in the neighborhood that displeases her royal sensibilities. I heard it twice last summer when I was edging my lawn with a blade edger instead of a string trimmer, and once in the fall when my leaf blower ran longer than she thought was appropriate for a Tuesday afternoon. I kept raking. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The heavy snow tumbled down the roof slope and landed in big, satisfying piles along my foundation. My roof was getting lighter by the minute. I could see the dark shingles appearing under the snow like the neighborhood slowly waking up. I was proud of myself, honestly. This was responsible homeownership. This was exactly what you were supposed to do in a real winter. Then my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I figured it was my brother texting about the football game later. I yanked off one glove with my teeth, fished the phone out, and squinted at the screen in the gray morning light. It was an email from the Maplewood Estates Homeowner Association. From Janet Crane personally, not even from the generic HOA account. From her direct email, which she apparently used freely for HOA business despite that being, as I would later find out, a violation of the HOA's own bylaws about official communications. The subject line read, Formal Noise Complaints Section 7.4, Immediate Action Required. I read it right there on my driveway, one glove still dangling from my mouth. The email stated, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, that I was in violation of Section 7.4 of the Maplewood Estates HOA Community Standards, which allegedly prohibits disruptive mechanical noise before 9 a.m. on weekends and holidays. The email claimed that my snow rake was causing excessive and disturbing mechanical scraping noises that were disrupting the peace and quiet enjoyment of neighboring properties. It said I was required to cease the activity immediately, and that failure to comply would result in a formal fine of $150, plus a secondary fine of $50 per each additional violation, applied daily until the issue was resolved. There was also a line at the bottom that said, in bold, documented and reported by HOA President Janet Crane, acting in her official capacity under the Maplewood Estates Community Governance Agreement. I stood there on my icy driveway in the blowing cold, reading that email twice, and I started laughing. Not a polite laugh, a real, genuine, stomach-hurting laugh that sent a puff of condensation vapor into the morning air. I put my glove back on, slid the phone back in my pocket, and kept raking. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Now I should give you some background on Janet Crane, because she didn't arrive at this level of pettiness overnight. She had been building up to it for years. Janet had been the HOA president of Maplewood Estates for 4 consecutive terms, which in a neighborhood of 42 homes with a 90% voter apathy rate, basically meant she just kept running unopposed and winning by default. She lived in the biggest house on the cul-de-sac, a colonial with vinyl shutters she'd painted a slightly different shade of green than what the HOA approved, which she never got cited for because she was the one doing the citing. Janet had a habit of sending complaints on behalf of neighbors who had never actually complained. She'd walk the neighborhood on Sunday mornings like she was patrolling the DMZ, taking photographs of anything that offended her, and then send out formal HOA letters citing rule violations for things like a garden hose left coiled on a front step, a garbage can visible from the street 20 minutes before pickup time, and once, memorably, a wind chime that she claimed violated the noise ordinance. That last one got thrown out when the homeowner, a retired schoolteacher named Carol, pointed out that the HOA's noise rule specifically exempted passive wind-generated sounds. Janet had then attempted to get the community to vote on a new wind chime policy. She lost 4-1, with the fifth vote being herself. I'd had my own run-ins with her before. 2 years ago, she cited me for having my basketball hoop too close to the sidewalk by approximately 8 inches. I moved it 8 inches and sent her a photo. She then cited me for having it in an unapproved recreational equipment position, which turned out to be a rule she'd invented verbally and had never actually been voted into the bylaws. I sent her a calm response asking her to cite the specific section and vote number where that rule was codified, and I never heard back about the basketball hoop again. This time, though, she'd escalated. A formal complaint with a fine attached was different from a verbal advisory. This was HOA bureaucracy with teeth, or at least teeth she thought she had. I finished raking my roof, stamped the snow off my boots on the front porch mat, and went inside. My house was warm, the furnace running steady, and I had a fresh pot of coffee already waiting because I'd set the timer the night before. I sat down at my kitchen table with my mug and pulled up the HOA bylaws document on my laptop. I downloaded it as a PDF 2 years ago specifically because of the basketball hoop incident, and I'd kept it saved in a folder I creatively labeled Janet. Section 7.4 was real. I'll give her that much. It did exist. It said verbatim, "No homeowner shall operate powered mechanical equipment, including but not limited to lawn mowers, leaf blowers, pressure washers, or similar gas or electric machinery, before 9 a.m. on Saturdays, Sundays, or recognized public holidays, as such equipment creates disruptive levels of mechanical noise." I read that sentence 4 times. Then I started grinning into my coffee mug. A snow rake is not powered equipment. It's a pole with a plastic blade on the end. It has no engine. It has no motor. It has no battery, no gas, no electricity. It is a manual hand tool. You push and pull it. It is about as powered mechanical equipment as a broom or a garden hoe. In fact, you could make a serious argument that it's less mechanically complex than a ratcheting screwdriver. The noise it makes comes from its physical contact with the roof surface, not from any mechanical power source. Under Janet's own logic, raking your leaves with a regular rake would also be a violation, because rakes make noise too when they drag across pavement. You'd essentially be banning any physical human activity that produces sound before 9 a.m., which was not what Section 7.4 said, and which no HOA in any jurisdiction has the legal authority to do anyway. I also noticed something else when I read the rule carefully. The list said lawn mowers, leaf blowers, pressure washers, or similar gas or electric machinery. That phrase, similar gas or electric machinery, was the qualifier. It wasn't just similar machinery. It was similar gas or electric machinery. My snow rake was neither gas nor electric. It was aluminum and plastic, operated by human muscle. It didn't even come close to fitting that definition. I opened a reply to Janet's email, thought about it for a second, and then closed it again. I wasn't going to reply yet. I wanted to do something first. I put my coat back on, went out to my car, and drove 4 blocks to the hardware store before it got too crowded. The roads were rough, still packed with snow from the overnight plowing that left ridges of compressed ice every 50 feet. My tires crunched and slid a little at the main intersection, even with my all-season tires. The whole town was moving slow and cautious, the kind of quiet winter morning where everyone collectively agrees to be a little more careful. I bought 2 things at the store: a replacement blade for my snow rake because the old one was getting worn, and a small battery-operated voice recorder, the kind journalists and students use. $8 in the clearance bin. When I got home, I also pulled up the Maplewood Estates HOA meeting minutes archive, which Janet had been diligently posting to the community website for years, apparently without realizing that those same minutes were going to be useful to someone someday. I went back through 2 years of minutes and started making notes. What I found was interesting. The HOA had a documented process for issuing fines. Under Section 14.2 of the bylaws, any fine over $50 required a formal hearing with the full board, not just the president acting unilaterally. The homeowner had to be given written notice at least 5 business days before the hearing, by certified mail, not email. The fine couldn't be levied until after the hearing concluded and the board voted. Janet had skipped all of that and sent me a fine notice via email on a Saturday morning before 9 a.m., which was, I noted with some amusement, probably the most ironic thing that had happened to me all year. Also, the board had 5 members. Janet was the president, but there were 4 other members: a semi-retired contractor named Phil, a work-from-home IT guy named Marcus, a physical therapist named Sandra, and a retiree named Gerald who mostly just showed up to meetings for the coffee. For a fine to be officially levied, 3 of the 5 members had to vote in favor. Janet couldn't levy a fine alone. She simply didn't have that authority under the bylaws. Her email to me was, in legal terms, what you might call a bluff. I spent the next hour writing a calm, polite, and absolutely devastating response. I drafted it in a Word document first, edited it 3 times, and read it out loud to make sure it didn't sound angry even though I was enjoying every word of it. My response said, in part, that I appreciated being informed of her concern, but that I respectfully disagreed with her interpretation of Section 7.4 for the following reasons. First, a manual snow rake does not constitute powered mechanical equipment under any reasonable reading of the rules text, which specifically qualifies the prohibited devices as gas or electric machinery. Second, under Section 14.2, any fine exceeding $50 requires a formal board hearing with 5 business days written notice by certified mail, a process that had not been initiated. Third, fines cannot be levied by the HOA president acting unilaterally without a board vote. And fourth, given that roof load management is not merely an aesthetic preference but a genuine structural safety concern under local building codes, any HOA rule that prevented a homeowner from safely maintaining their roof during extreme winter conditions would very likely be found unenforceable as a matter of public safety. I then noted, at the bottom, that I had documented the email and would retain it for my records, and that I looked forward to the matter being reviewed by the full board if she wished to proceed formally. I hit send and made myself another coffee. It took Janet 45 minutes to reply. 45 minutes on a Saturday morning when, presumably, she was supposed to be enjoying her peace and quiet. Her response was considerably less polished than mine. She said that my interpretation of the rule was incorrect and self-serving, that her authority as HOA president allowed her to issue warnings and notices as she saw fit, and that if I refused to comply, she would escalate the matter through all available channels. I saved that email too. Over the next few days, the neighborhood was buried under more snow. Another 6 inches fell Monday night into Tuesday, and then a hard freeze set it all in place so that the roads turned into a skating rink and half the driveways on the block became legitimate hazards. I was out with my shovel Tuesday morning before work, clearing my driveway and then throwing some ice melt down for good measure. My neighbor to the left, Tom, was doing the same. We waved at each other over the hedge. Tom asked me if I'd heard about the complaint situation. I told him I had, seeing as it was directed at me. He snorted. He said Janet had also apparently sent a complaint about his gas-powered snow blower, which definitely did fall under Section 7.4's Powered Equipment Clause, except Tom had been running it at 6:45 a.m. on a weekday, not a weekend, and Section 7.4 only applied to weekends and holidays. He'd already replied pointing that out. She hadn't responded. Marcus, the IT guy on the HOA board, texted me Tuesday afternoon. He said he wanted me to know that he had not been consulted about the complaint or the fine notice before Janet sent them, that he disagreed with how she'd handled it, and that if she brought it to a formal hearing, he was likely to vote against the fine. He also mentioned, somewhat carefully, that this wasn't the first time Janet had sent out notices and fines without consulting the board, and that he and Phil had been quietly documenting those instances for a while. That was very interesting information. I asked Marcus if he'd be willing to share those documents informally, not for any legal action yet, just for context. He said he'd think about it and let me know. Meanwhile, Janet had apparently decided that the best way to handle my pushback was to double down. On Wednesday, I got a physical letter in my mailbox, not certified mail, just a regular envelope with the HOA's return address printed on it. Inside was a formal notice, on HOA letterhead, stating that I had been issued a violation notice for persistent disruptive noise activities, and that a fine of $150 had been assessed against my account, with the instruction that it be paid within 30 days or additional penalties would accrue. It also, for the first time, mentioned a second complaint, that my roof raking activity was creating a hazard to pedestrian safety because the snow I raked off my roof was landing near the public sidewalk. I stood in my driveway reading that letter in the cold, the wind biting at my cheeks, and I thought about that for a long moment. My house sits on a corner lot. There is no public sidewalk adjacent to my roof. The snow I raked off my roof lands in my front yard, against my foundation, in my garden beds, which are buried under a foot of snow anyway, and in the narrow side yard between my house and the property line. None of it goes anywhere near a sidewalk or a public walkway, not even close. There is a distance of at least 25 feet between where my snow lands and where the nearest sidewalk begins. I know this because I have a survey plot of my property taped inside my garage door because I'm that kind of person. The pedestrian hazard claim was not just wrong. It was demonstrably, photographically, measurably wrong. I went inside, got my phone, put my coat back on, and went back outside to take photographs. I took pictures of my entire front yard showing the snow piles from the roof rake, the distance between those piles and the sidewalk itself, which was clear because I'd shoveled it that morning. I took pictures from multiple angles. I took a picture of my property survey plot in my garage. I time-stamped everything by keeping a printout of a weather report showing the date and temperature in the frame of one of the photos. Then I called my city's municipal code enforcement office, not to report anything yet, just to ask a question. I spoke with a very nice gentleman named Jerry who told me, in no uncertain terms, that using a manual snow rake to remove snow from your own roof is not a violation of any municipal ordinance in our city, that the snow does not need to be removed from your property after it falls from the roof as long as it does not obstruct a public right-of-way, and that the city actually encourages roof raking for safety reasons in heavy snow events. He also said that if I'd like, he could put that in a brief written statement, and I said yes, please. That would be wonderful, Jerry. Thank you so much. Jerry emailed me the written statement before 3 p.m. I printed it out and added it to my growing folder. The folder now contained Janet's original complaint email, my response, her reply to my response, the formal fine notice, photographs of my property with timestamps, the HOA bylaws with relevant sections highlighted, the HOA meeting minutes showing the proper fine process had not been followed, the city's written statement from Jerry, and Tom's description of his own complaint situation, which he'd agreed to write down for me in a brief informal note. I also had something else. I'd almost forgotten about it until I was pulling my car into the garage and glanced up at the corner of the garage ceiling. About 8 months ago, after someone had rummaged through a few unlocked cars in the neighborhood overnight, I'd installed a security camera system. 4 cameras total. One faces the front of my house and covers most of my driveway and the front yard. One covers the side yard. One covers the backyard. And one is aimed at the street, specifically at the cul-de-sac turnaround, because that's where the car rummaging had happened. The camera aimed at the cul-de-sac had a clear line of sight to Janet Crane's driveway and front walkway. I hadn't thought about the cameras in months because nothing had happened that required me to review the footage. But now I sat down at my computer, pulled up the camera software, and started going back through the recorded footage. I started with the morning of my roof raking, the Saturday when Janet had sent the complaint email at 7:48 a.m. I watched the footage from the cul-de-sac camera, which runs continuously and saves to a local hard drive, and what I saw made me stop and rewind it. At 7:31 a.m., approximately 3 minutes after I'd started raking my roof, Janet Crane came out of her front door. She was dressed in her heavy parka with the fur-lined hood. She walked to the end of her driveway, stopped, and looked directly at my house. She stood there for about 20 seconds, then she went back inside. At 7:48 a.m., I received her complaint email. Now here's where it got interesting. I kept watching the footage going back to previous weekends and weekday mornings, and I noticed something. Janet's neighbor on the east side, a young couple named Bri and Derek, had an older model snowblower, a gas-powered one, that Derek ran regularly. I found 3 instances on the footage from the past 3 weekends where Derek was running his snowblower before 9 a.m. on a Saturday or Sunday, once as early as 7:15. I checked the HOA complaint records, which Janet posted to the community website as a monthly summary. Derek had received 0 complaints. Tom's snowblower showed up in the footage too, running on weekday mornings before work, which as he'd told me was technically not covered by Section 7.4. But more interestingly, Tom's snowblower also appeared twice in weekend footage before 9 a.m. Tom had received 1 complaint warning, but no fine. I, with my manual aluminum snow rake that has no motor and no engine, received a $150 fine notice. I watched more footage. I went back to November, then October, and I found something that made my stomach drop a little, not out of surprise, but out of the sheer brazenness of it. In October, Janet had been going door to door in the evenings. I'd noticed her doing it at the time and figured she was campaigning for her HOA president re-election, which had come up in November. Looking at the footage now, I could see her stopping at certain houses and not others. She was going to the houses of HOA board members, past and present. I watched her on my camera footage stop at Phil's house, then Marcus's, then Sandra's, then Gerald's. She spent about 15 minutes at each house. I thought about that and then I called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. I asked him what Janet had talked to him about in October during those evening visits. There was a pause. He said she'd told him that she was considering implementing a new HOA fee structure that would raise the monthly dues slightly, and that she wanted board member support before bringing it to a community vote. She'd told him the extra money would go into the HOA reserve fund for community improvements. He thought it was reasonable and told her he'd support it. The fee increase had passed in November. The new structure raised monthly HOA dues by $30 per household per month. 42 homes. That was $1,260 per month in additional revenue flowing into the HOA account. I asked Marcus if he knew what the HOA reserve fund balance was currently. He said he didn't actually, because Janet handled the finances and he'd never been given a detailed accounting statement. That was the second moment where my stomach did the dropping thing. Under the HOA's own governance documents, which I went back and read very carefully that evening while my furnace worked overtime against the -12 wind chill outside, the HOA treasurer was required to provide a full financial accounting to all board members on a quarterly basis. The treasurer, according to the HOA's own organizational chart posted on the community website, was Janet Crane. She had been simultaneously HOA president and HOA treasurer since the previous treasurer, a man named Bob, had moved out of the neighborhood 2 years ago. She'd appointed herself to both roles without holding the election that the bylaws required for the treasurer position, and she hadn't provided a quarterly financial accounting to the board members in, as Marcus confirmed when I asked, at least 8 months. Now I was dealing with something that went well beyond a noise complaint about a snow rake. I called Phil, the semi-retired contractor, the next morning. Phil was a straight talker, the kind of guy who wore flannel year-round and had opinions about lumber grades. He listened to what I told him, asked me to email him the relevant bylaw sections, and called me back 40 minutes later. He said he'd been feeling uncomfortable about the HOA finances for a while. He said that last spring he'd asked Janet about getting an itemized list of how the HOA's landscaping contract money was being spent, and she'd told him it was being handled and not to worry about it. He dropped it because he didn't want the confrontation. He regretted that now. He also told me something I hadn't known. The HOA had, about 18 months ago, hired a landscaping company to redo the common area plantings at the neighborhood entrance. The contract was supposed to be for $4,000. Phil had seen the proposal because he'd been the one who recommended the landscaping company, a local outfit run by a guy named Steve. But when the work was done, Steve had told Phil privately that he'd only been paid $2,000 and that the HOA had told him the remaining $2,000 had been redirected to another community project. Steve had been irritated but hadn't pushed it because he wanted to keep getting HOA referrals from the neighborhood. $4,000 budgeted, $2,000 paid, $2,000 gone somewhere else. I went very still in my kitchen when Phil told me that. I said, "Phil, I think we need to call for an emergency board meeting." He said, "Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. Here's the thing about HOA bylaws that most people don't read until they need them. They usually give individual board members the right to call a special meeting. Maplewood Estates bylaws were no different. Under Section 11.3, any 2 board members could jointly call for a special board meeting with 15 days' notice to all homeowners. Phil and Marcus agreed to jointly file the request. They sent it by certified mail to all homeowners and posted it to the community website on a Friday afternoon. The subject of the special meeting, a full review of HOA financial records, and a vote on the recent fine notices issued without board approval. Janet's response was immediate and spectacular. She sent a community-wide email that same evening, which showed up in my inbox at 11 p.m., saying that the special meeting was unnecessary, divisive, and in violation of the spirit of community cooperation. She said the fine notices were lawful, and that any homeowner who had received one should understand that they were being issued for the good of the community. She also said, and this is the line that really got people talking the next morning, that she would be seeking legal counsel regarding board members who she believed were acting in bad faith against the HOA's interests. That email went to all 42 homeowners, and it woke a lot of people up who had been paying their dues and ignoring HOA politics for years. My phone started buzzing with texts and the neighborhood Facebook group, which had been mostly used for lost dog alerts and recommendations for pizza places, suddenly became very active. A woman named Patty, who lived 6 houses down and had previously received a fine for having a decorative flag on her porch that Janet had deemed non-compliant with decorative display guidelines, posted the full text of the bylaw sections I'd been citing. She'd clearly done her own reading. A guy named Rob posted a photo of a fine notice he'd received for his shed color, a fine that had also been issued without a board hearing. Someone else posted that they'd received a fine for a fence height that, when they measured, was actually within the approved dimensions. By Saturday morning, I had identified 7 other homeowners who had received fines from Janet that had been issued without the required board hearing and vote. The amounts ranged from $50 to $200 each. Several people had paid them without questioning. One of those people was a single mom named Karen, not the pejorative Karen, just a woman named Karen, who lived at the end of the block with her 2 kids. She'd paid a $120 fine 8 months ago for having a basketball hoop in her driveway. She'd had the money, barely, and she'd paid it because she'd been scared of what might happen if she didn't. When she found out the fine had never been properly authorized by the board, she cried in the neighborhood Facebook group. That post alone got 47 responses in 2 hours. That's when the mood of the neighborhood shifted from mildly interested to genuinely angry. The special meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center, which was a large room in the basement of the neighborhood's shared amenity building. It had a propane heater that worked intermittently and usually made the room smell faintly of gas. And on this particular January Thursday, with the temperature sitting at 7 degrees outside and the wind moving snow across the parking lot in horizontal sheets, every single one of Maplewood Estate's 42 homeowners either showed up in person or sent a representative. That had never happened in the HOA's 12-year history. Janet arrived in her parka, her reading glasses hanging around her neck on a beaded chain, carrying a leather portfolio, and looking like she was ready to run a board meeting the way she always did, which was to say, with herself firmly in control of the agenda, the timeline, and the outcome. She was about to find out that this meeting was different. Phil opened the meeting because, as he pointed out with barely concealed satisfaction, the bylaws allowed the meeting's calling party to open it, not necessarily the president. Janet started to object and Phil read the relevant bylaw section directly from a printed copy, right out loud, in front of everyone. She stopped objecting. The first order of business was the fine notices. Phil walked through the board's voting authority, the required hearing process, and the certified mail requirement. He listed the 9 homeowners, including me, who had received improperly issued fines. He asked Janet to explain why the proper process hadn't been followed. Janet said she had been acting within her discretionary authority as HOA president, that delays in the fine process allowed violations to continue, and that the board had implicitly delegated this authority to her through their inaction on complaints she'd brought to their attention. Marcus asked her to show him where in the bylaws that implicit delegation was codified. She said it was a matter of established practice. He said established practice doesn't supersede written bylaw requirements. The room was very quiet and very cold because the propane heater had chosen this moment to be temperamental. The second order of business was the financial review. Phil asked Janet to present the quarterly financial statements that were required under Section 9.7 of the bylaws. Janet said she didn't have them prepared for tonight because she hadn't anticipated this being on the agenda. Phil pointed out that they'd given 15 days' notice and that Section 9.7 required quarterly statements to be provided regardless, meaning the most recent one was already overdue. Sandra, the physical therapist board member who had been quiet until now, said, in a very even and precise voice, that she'd like to formally motion that all HOA financial records be made available to the full board within 10 business days, that an independent accountant be retained to review the books going back 2 years, and that all fine payments collected outside the proper authorization process be identified and refunded. Marcus seconded it. They voted, 4-1, the one being Janet. Janet's face had gone a very specific shade of pale that I recognized as someone who had just realized they were no longer in control of the situation. The accountant, a woman named Deborah who did taxes for half the neighborhood anyway and agreed to do the HOA review for a reduced community rate, got access to the HOA's financial records 10 days later. It took her 2 weeks to complete the review. What she found was sent to every homeowner via email and certified mail, and it was not good. Over a period of approximately 22 months, there were 43 transactions totaling just under $11,000 that Deborah could not match to any documented HOA project, vendor invoice, approved budget line, or board vote. The landscaping underpayment Phil had heard about from Steve was in there. So was a shortfall in what should have been a repaving project on the community walking path. So were a series of smaller withdrawals in amounts between $80 and $300, occurring roughly monthly, with no corresponding receipts or project documentation. The fine money that Janet had collected improperly, totaling just over $900 across multiple homeowners, was also unaccounted for. There was no record of it being deposited into the HOA reserve fund or any other account. It had been collected by check, made out to the HOA, and then it had effectively disappeared into the same cloud of undocumented transactions. Deborah's report was careful and precise. She noted that she was not a forensic accountant and could not make legal determinations, but that the pattern of transactions was, in her professional opinion, consistent with the misappropriation of funds and warranted referral to appropriate authorities. Phil made the call. Sandra was on the phone with him when he did it. They reported it to the police non-emergency line, which bounced them to the financial crimes unit, and 2 detectives came out to the neighborhood on a Tuesday morning and spent 3 hours at Marcus's house going through the documentation. Janet was informed of the investigation the following week. She sent a community email, her last one from the HOA account, saying that the allegations were baseless and malicious, and the result of a coordinated attack by disgruntled homeowners. She announced that she was retaining her own legal representation. She also, and this was the part that genuinely surprised me, sent me a personal email specifically referencing my original snow rake complaint and saying that if I dropped my involvement in the financial review, she would rescind my fine and consider the matter closed. I forwarded that email to the detectives handling the case the same afternoon. They noted it as a potential witness tampering issue and added it to their file. The investigation took about 3 months. It moved faster than I expected, honestly. By mid-April, with the snow finally gone and the neighborhood slowly thawing out into something resembling normal life, Janet Crane was charged with theft by deception and misappropriation of funds in the amount of $8,700, which was the amount Deborah's forensic review, supplemented by a proper forensic accountant hired by the police, was able to attribute definitively to unauthorized withdrawals from HOA accounts. She was not arrested dramatically at her door or anything like that. She self-surrendered with her lawyer present. But her car was gone from the cul-de-sac by the time I got home from work that day, and neighbors quietly shared the news through the neighborhood group by that evening. She pleaded no contest about 6 months later and received a sentence of 2 years probation, a requirement to make full restitution to the HOA in the amount of $8,700 plus interest, and a permanent bar from serving in any fiduciary role in any homeowner association or community organization in the state. Her lawyer had gotten the criminal conviction reduced to a civil finding on the misappropriation charge, which meant no jail time, but the restitution order was real and enforceable. The 9 of us who had received improperly issued fines got full refunds from the HOA once the new board was seated and the books were sorted out. Karen, the single mom with the basketball hoop, got her $120 back with a handwritten note from the new HOA treasurer, Phil, who had reluctantly agreed to take on the role temporarily. He said he'd do it for a year, and then they were finding someone else. The note said he was sorry it had taken so long. Oh, and the new board's first official action was a formal resolution clarifying that manual snow tools including snow rakes, shovels, ice scrapers, and brooms were not subject to Section 7.4 of the Community Standards, because they do not constitute powered mechanical equipment under any reasonable interpretation of the rule. The resolution also noted that roof maintenance activity for the purpose of preventing structural damage is protected under public safety considerations and cannot be restricted by the HOA regardless of noise incidental to the activity. They sent that resolution to all 42 homeowners by email. I was standing in my kitchen reading it when I got a text from Tom, my neighbor to the left, that just said "lol" and a snow rake emoji. I grinned and sent one back. Now here's the part of the story that I want to make sure I tell right, because it's easy to look at the outcome: Janet charged, money recovered, rules clarified, and think it was all satisfying and clean. And in a lot of ways it was. But it also took months of careful documentation, calm emails that I really wanted to write very differently, multiple conversations with neighbors who were scared or skeptical or just exhausted from winter, and a lot of hours reading HOA bylaws in the evenings while the wind rattled my windows and my furnace ran on full blast. The reason it worked was documentation. Every single step, from the first complaint email to the final restitution order. I saved every communication. I took photographs with timestamps. I got written statements from city officials. I kept the camera footage organized on my hard drive and backed it up to a second drive because I am paranoid in a way that turned out to be very justified. When I presented information to neighbors or to the police or to Deborah the accountant, I had the receipts, literal and figurative. I also want to say something about Marcus and Phil and Sandra, because those 3 people had the harder job in some ways than I did. I was just a homeowner who got a bogus fine and fought it. They were board members who had to make the uncomfortable decision to turn on their own president, to force a review they knew might blow up the organization they'd been trying to run in good faith, and to follow through even when Janet's emails got personal, and her lawyer sent them letters implying they might face personal liability for calling the meeting. They didn't back down. Phil especially. He was gruff and quiet about it, but he was absolutely immovable once he'd made up his mind. Gerald, the retiree who mostly came to meetings for the coffee, voted with them every time. He also showed up to every single meeting during the investigation wearing the same blue flannel shirt. I don't know why, but it felt important. The neighborhood is different now. Not dramatically, not in ways that would make a before and after photo. The houses look the same. The cul-de-sac looks the same, but people talk more. The Facebook group is active with actual conversations, not just complaint threads. We had a community winter cleanup day in February where 12 homeowners came out to help clear ice from the shared walking path that had been a hazard all season, because the path maintenance had been one of the underfunded projects. Marcus brought his snowblower. Tom brought his. Nobody complained about the noise. The new HOA under Phil and the restructured board has monthly financial summaries posted publicly on the community website. Any fine over $25 requires a documented hearing notice and a board vote. The president and treasurer roles are permanently separated. Monthly dues were reduced by $20 once the restitution payments started flowing in, because the HOA's actual operating costs, it turned out, were considerably lower than the budget Janet had been running. Janet's house went on the market in the spring. She moved out quietly on a Tuesday in April while most of the neighborhood was at work. A young family with 2 small kids bought it in June. They have an inflatable kiddie pool in the backyard in summer, and the kids are loud and happy about it. Nobody has filed a complaint. This past January, when the first big snowfall of the new season came down overnight and left 8 inches on every rooftop in Maplewood Estates, I went out to my garage the next morning, grabbed my snow rake, and went to work. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Tom was out next door doing the same. He'd gotten himself a new roof rake with a slightly longer handle, the kind where the blade curves up at the end to catch more snow per pass. We waved at each other. My breath came out in big white clouds. The morning was gray and cold and very quiet except for the sound of our rakes working. My phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. "Are you snow raking already, lol?" I typed back one-handed with my glove off. Section 7.4 says I can. Resolution 2020-401 confirms it. I have it on camera. He sent back a laughing emoji. I pulled another big load of snow off the east side of my roof and watched it tumble down into my front yard in a satisfying rush of white powder, landing exactly where it always lands, 20-something feet from the nearest sidewalk, just like it always did. My house was warm behind me, my furnace running steady, the smell of coffee drifting out through the kitchen exhaust vent. No complaint arrived. No email pinged. No storm window slammed open across the cul-de-sac. Just a cold, quiet, ordinary winter morning. Just a guy taking care of his house. Exactly the way it was supposed to be. The thing I think about sometimes, when I'm in a philosophical mood, which usually happens on long winter evenings when there's nothing to do but wait for the temperature to come back up, is how many times Janet's tactics must have worked before they worked on the wrong person. How many neighbors had quietly paid the fines, moved their basketball hoops, taken down their wind chimes, not because they'd done anything wrong but because they didn't know what the bylaws actually said, or didn't have time to find out, or were just tired and wanted the problem to go away. She had built her whole operation on that exhaustion. On the reasonable human desire to not have a fight with your neighbor, not have a conflict with the HOA, not spend your evenings reading governance documents when you could be watching TV or helping your kids with homework. She counted on apathy. She weaponized inconvenience. She turned the administrative complexity of HOA bylaws into a tool for extraction, and she did it slowly, incrementally, over years, in amounts small enough that each individual homeowner thought they were the only one dealing with it, and that it wasn't worth the trouble to push back. It took a snow rake and a cold Saturday morning to break the spell. I'm not saying I'm a hero. I'm really not. I'm a middle-aged guy who happens to have a folder on his laptop called Janet, and a habit of reading the fine print. I got lucky that my situation happened at the right time, when enough other people were already quietly fed up, when the right board members happened to have been paying attention and had some backbone, when a neighbor happened to know an accountant who knew what to look for. But I'm also not going to pretend that the documentation didn't matter, that the calm emails didn't matter, that the security camera footage and the city official statement and the bylaw citations didn't matter. They mattered enormously. Every single piece of paper in that folder mattered. If you live in an HOA, download your bylaws. Read them. Not all at once if you don't want to, but section by section over time. Know what your HOA president can and can't do. Know what process is required before a fine can be levied. Know what your rights are around modifications, landscaping, equipment, and noise. Know your state's HOA statute, because most states have one, and it supersedes the HOA's own documents in many situations. Know that a fine notice is not the same as a fine. Know that a complaint is not the same as a violation. And if someone in a HOA role sends you an email before 9 a.m. on a Saturday claiming that your hand-powered snow rake is a mechanical noise violation, read the bylaw they're citing very carefully before you do anything else. Because gas or electric machinery does not mean aluminum pole dragged across roof shingles. Not even close. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Have a good winter.